So nice to meet you.
We have said hello already. We met already. Yes. Okay. Look forward to it.
Okay. I think we may start.
Would you get here?
Yesterday afternoon.
So the jet lag must still be
A little bit.
tough.
Yeah, that's right. Afternoon is okay. It's the mornings.
I don't think we need these. It's gonna be.
If I can beg you to sit down, we are going to start. And it would be nice from you to allow us to speak. Great pleasure. Thank you so much. Okay, here we go. We are at the first panel of the fourth edition of Med Conference, and we are starting maybe from the core business, that is security and stability in the region. Of course, I'm being banal by saying that security and stability is a little bit out of reach right now, and we are collectively as international community in our various responsibilities, different responsibilities, governments, public opinion, parliaments, firms, etc., we're trying to promote it, but it seems increasingly more and more difficult, because what actually appears to us is that the elements of division are far more than the elements that unite, and at least the elements that unite are not in the headlines of the newspaper. It is very difficult to sketch out really a positive agenda. One of the reasons is, of course, that we are still in presence of a huge number of conflicts, a huge number of rivalries, several questions of several ambitions of regional hegemony, which are on three levels, I would say. One local level, that is in various situations of crisis, you always have a local level. I mean, the country or the countries in which the crisis unfolds. Then you have somebody that likes to be present from far away, that is proxy conflicts, proxy war, proxy influences. And then, of course, you have the rest of the world, which is also, in a way, part of the picture. So let's call them superpowers or just powers, I don't know. But anyway, elements that are there more often than seldom to make the situations more and more complicated. So we have here quite an outstanding panel to discuss about those kinds of arguments. As it is in the spirit of Med, we are not that much looking for solutions, because those are out of the scope of a dialogue, but we are looking to confronting different points of view and looking for enablers, that is, looking for drivers to be able to promote a more sensible and more positive agendas in the region and beyond. Our panelists, Mr. Ahmed Abul Gheit is Secretary General of the Arab League, long-standing Minister of Foreign Affairs for Egypt. I can personally recall his tenure as Ambassador of Egypt to Rome, which is always nice memories. Then we have Mr. Hamad al-BUSAIDI, who is Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Oman. And I really very cordially share his sorrows as a former Italian Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry. I know what it can mean, and so I'm warmly with you. We had, of course, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan, Mr. al-SAFADI. and Mr. Kim Holmes, who is Executive Vice President of the Heritage Foundation. And I would maybe start with Minister ABOUL GHEIT, Secretary General ABOUL GHEIT, maybe with one a bit banal, but how can I say, nevertheless, I think not least of the meaningful question. That is, from your point of view, what kind of overall balance could be sketched, if any, in the region in order to promote stability?
Thank you very much, Giampiero. That question you are asking is an extremely complex question. I've been asking myself so many years, what had happened in this region leading to that turmoil? I often claim or think, is it the war between Iraq and Iran in 1980? Is it the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait? Is it the Iraqi war? Is it 9/11? What really happened? Is it the invasion of Iraq itself? And we have listened a few minutes ago to the Iraqi president, and he is saying that Iraq is the crux of, or the stability, or the balance in the region. And often I come to a conclusion that whatever that had happened over 30, 40 years, maybe the worst of the worst happened after 2011. You often in Europe say, and you name it as a spring. In all honesty, I claim it is a destruction of the Arab world. And it allowed others to seek intervention and to seek what we call hegemony, or you're saying hegemony. Hegemony will not prevail in that region. I recall after 9/11, some American historian, Paul Johnson, saying, let's recolonize the region. Recolonize the region. A very harsh statement. I've been attending so many meetings over the last 2.5 years. In this room, people were seeking a new balance through what you call, or Minister Gentiloni said at the time, let's have a Helsinki arrangement, or type of a Helsinki arrangement. I go to a security conference in Munich, and it is Westphalia arrangements. I do not understand what do we mean by Westphalia arrangements. Nothing is rejected, but everything, in my opinion, is premature. We cannot jump to arrangements in the region without understanding what is happening in the region. The region is mainly an Arab region, from Agadir, overlooking the Atlantic, to Muscat and Oman, overlooking the Indian, and Mediterranean, and Red Sea, and Africa, and Europe. So that is a region that is really the core of the wider region you call the Middle East. The issue is, how are we to regain control on the Arab region, hence the region itself? I think the nation state is a must. A new nation state, meaning a nation state that embodies everything the Iraqi president spoke about rule of law, respect of citizenship, and the equality of citizenship. That is the new Middle East or the new Arab world we are seeking. Also, most important, they need not to intervene in internal affairs of other people's affairs, because the tendency is, let's control them, let's have influence in their own territory. As I say, and I see that my time is approaching, as I say, the core is the Arab world. So we have to revive the League of Arab States, the Arab security system, as a core of the region. Then the outer tier, as we call it, the other Muslim major players, Turkey, Iran, and the Sahara south of North Africa. That, I think, Arab countries would be interested in engaging, but without hegemony and without the desire to control or to influence. Why is it so? Because the Arab world is too huge and too rich and too strong, despite the turmoil we have, to allow others to control it. We have to insist on certain requirements. There has to be a settlement for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In the absence of that settlement, nothing would materialize, nothing, and the turmoil will continue. Other thing is the regional neighbors, they have to respect the integrity of our Arab territory. Iran, I think, though trying to defend its own interest, but should not. Iran should think deeply on reversing its attitude and behavior on so many issues in relation to Arab countries. Finally comes Turkey. I personally understand Turkish attitudes. However, Turkey also has to understand that trying to defend your own integrity, territorial integrity, you should not impose yourself on territories of others, whether it is in northern Syria or northern Iraq. That, if achieved, if agreed upon, I think there would be a new regional order in the region, allowing League of Arab States as the core to engage on whatever arrangements, name it what you have, Helsinki or anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for sticking so much to the time schedule, and you are sketching out a very ambitious agenda, by the way, with a lot of simplicity, but your words really imply a huge dose of diplomacy and mediation. And so I maybe turn to Secretary General BUSAIDI. Your country, Oman, used to play a very balanced role in the region. Also, fairly recently, during the intra-Gulf crisis, which, by the way, does not look to be yet, as for now, completely solved. So what is your perspective from this point of view? This tool of mediation and diplomacy, what can we achieve through those kind of means?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Mr. MASSOLO, first for your remarkable introductory remarks. and also for chairing our session. And really, I would also like, first of all, to thank our hosts, our Italian friends, for this conference, for the impeccable organization, and for their hospitality.
Eccellenze, cari colleghi, gentili ospiti, la ricerca della stabilità regionale è una ricerca costante. È un processo continuo e è basato sull'equilibrio, un equilibrio oltre il dialogo e comprensione. Il sultano dell'Oman ha sempre considerato l'equilibrio nelle relazioni regionali e internazionali come parte della nostra cultura. Verso la fine del XVIII secolo, oltre 200 anni fa, abbiamo potuto controbilanciare le nostre relazioni con potenze come il Regno Unito, la Francia, ed oggi siamo l'ago della bilancia tra le relazioni dell'Est e dell'Ovest e soprattutto le relazioni con gli Stati Uniti e con l'Iran. Secondo il nostro punto di vista, l'equilibrio è assolutamente imprescindibile per la stabilità. Senza l'equilibrio non ci può essere una situazione di stabilità, non c'è la stabilità senza l'equilibrio. L'approccio dell'Oman è stato ripreso dal ministro palestinese che si è recato presso di noi il 20 ottobre e questo è stato seguito il 26 ottobre dalla visita del primo ministro israeliano Benjamin Netanyahu. Questi dialoghi
of the diplomacy of balance and the eternal quest for peace and stability. Above all, they highlight, as the Secretary General just mentioned, the urgent need to find a just and lasting solution to the Palestinian problem. Resolving this problem has become a strategic necessity, without which the region will continue to struggle from one difficulty to another. Equally, as Oman's minister responsible for foreign affairs, Yusuf bin Alawi, has observed at the recent Manama dialogue in Bahrain, the Arab states need to come to terms with the reality that Israel is a fact of life in the region, and as such, it should have to share the rights as well as obligations. The war in Yemen, for example, is currently the world's most pressing humanitarian crisis. And although Israel, like a number of other regional states, is not directly involved, its voice can be influential. Relations between the Arab Gulf and Iran have deteriorated in recent years, and this is a complex matter with numerous aspects. But we should all do whatever we can to lower the temperature, to find a path for dialogue which might lead to mutual understanding and stability. Inevitably, there has been some hostile comments about Mr. Netanyahu's visit in certain quarters, in particular in social media. And I would simply observe that in the business of peacemaking, it is absolutely essential that we should all talk with each other, especially with those we disagree with. If we don't talk to those you disagree with, you're not going to get very far. Indeed, Oman has always believed in dialogue, and we are always pleased to practice what we preach. Dialogue is, to state the obvious, the art of listening. And to put it bluntly, the stance of anyone who aspires to hegemony is not a listening stance. This is just a fact of human nature. We are fallible. We have egos. Those who aspire to hegemony, if they have power and act on their aspirations, are inevitably disruptive of stability because they create disequilibrium and lack the pragmatism required for dialogue. So the quest for regional stability can only conclude successfully through the abandonment of hegemonic aspirations on all sides, through adopting the diplomacy of balance, fostering dialogue, and achieving equilibrium. That's all I have to say at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, you were right in saying that actually the right method is to employ patience, strategic patience and dialogue, but what happens when the fallout of the crisis directly impacts on the stability of the country you live in? Because to promote the dialogue, you have to be stable and firm at home, and sometimes, at least looking from outside, we have to admire Jordanian efforts in order to maintain stability and trying to shield from turmoil coming from outside. Mr. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And if I may start by thanking you and thanking our gracious hosts, the Italian Foreign Ministry, for hosting this conference and for giving us this opportunity to engage in what you just said, a dialogue to try and see how we can deal with issues. And the Middle East is certainly a place that is in tremendous need for very honest, very open dialogue so that we can all move towards the stability, prosperity, security that all peoples of the region deserve. Beyond the conflict is a tremendous potential. Ours is a region endowed with tremendous human power, tremendous natural resources. But to unleash that potential, we have to get beyond conflict. And to get beyond conflict, we need to be honest, we need to identify the sources of threat, and we need to move towards solutions that will bring about peace and stability. And for that peace and stability to happen, peoples of the region need to feel that they've gotten a fair deal out of all that. So, beyond the sort of generalities, what are the sources of threat that we're dealing with right now in the region? And what is required to be able to move to that point beyond conflict, which will allow us all in the neighborhood? And when I mean in the neighborhood, I don't just mean the Middle East, because Europe is part of the neighborhood. And in an increasingly interconnected universe, the US is part of the neighborhood. Everybody is part of the neighborhood in terms of the fact that everything that happens in the region is having a direct impact in the region and way beyond. Our view in Jordan is that peace is a must. Peace is a right of all peoples, and as such, Jordan has done everything it could for years and years, for decades and decades, not only to reach peace, but also to contribute to the creation of conditions that would allow for sustaining that peace. Our view is that absent a fair solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the region will never have peace and stability. How do we get to that peace? By having a solution that will address the legitimate rights of Palestinians to freedom and statehood and will assure Israel of the security and acceptance that it deserves. The two-state solution is the only viable solution to move forward. Absent than that, we're going to immerse deeper in conflict. And with all due respect, the Arabs have come to terms with Israel being part of the region. The Arab Peace Initiative has been on the table since 2002. And the Arab Peace Initiative is not an ultimatum. It's an invitation for Israel to sit on the table and negotiate a peaceful solution that would result in ending occupation and a full acceptance and normalization by all Arab states. All that we're asking is the legitimate rights of Palestinians to live in freedom and in their own state on the basis of June 4, 1967, with East Jerusalem as their capital, and recognizing that East Jerusalem is the key to peace. It is a city that's holy to Muslims, to Christians, and to Jews. And instead of keeping it a place for conflict, what we need to do as an outcome of that peace is to make Jerusalem a symbol for peace, a unifier for all of us, and allowing us to really live the spirit of peace that this city should represent. So, the current situation in the Middle East, in as far as the peace process is concerned, is very stalemated. There's a deadlock. There's almost a dead end. That's something that we cannot afford, because the loss of hope is only going to contribute to further consolidating the feelings of despair and anger, which provides a fertile environment for everything that's radical, for everything that is extremist to thrive. And therefore, providing hope by solving this problem is also a very important tool in our collective effort in fighting terrorism and fighting Daesh and the likes of Daesh. Daesh is a common threat, and that is something that we need to recognize. It is not part of Islam. His Majesty King Abdullah calls them Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam. And he also says that Daesh has been defeated but not destroyed. In order to destroy Daesh, we need to destroy the environment of despair and loss of opportunity on which it thrives. And that means we need to create potential, economic potential, social potential, and most importantly, political potential, because outside a political context, very little can move, because conflicts are going to consume all of us. Which brings me to Syria, which is again a major conflict that has consumed the region. For 7 years, that conflict has gotten from bad to worse. Where are we now? The choice is to continue to double down on positions that have gotten us where we are, or to employ a different approach that would recognize reality and will bring the conflict back to being about Syria and the Syrians, and immune it to the extent possible from the rivalry of agendas and the conflict of powers. Which means we have to have a political solution. That political solution needs to maintain the integrity of Syria, and a solution that Syrian people accept, and create conditions that would allow for Syria to regain its stability, regain its security, and regain its role as a key for peace and stability in the region, and as a key pillar to the Arab order that His Excellency has just spoken of. These are difficult stories that are still in search of a solution. We have a good story in Iraq, though. And as His Excellency President Saleh has just mentioned, Iraq has defeated Daesh at a very high sacrifice. Now, sustaining that victory requires that we all support Iraq as it tries to achieve the goals that His Excellency the President has just laid out: stabilization and the success of a political process that will ensure conditions conducive for all the Iraqis to come together and move forward. Iraq fought the war against Daesh with the support of the coalition, led by the United States, as the President said, with the support and coordination by all of us. Now we also need to come together with a view to making sure that that victory is protected by a movement towards economic opportunity, social opportunity, and political horizon. And that, again, is going to require collective efforts by all of us. Whatever happens in the Middle East is having an impact everywhere. The challenges are global in terms of their consequences. The answers have to be global in terms of the coordination, in terms of allocating the resources that we need to have. Ultimately, again, nobody is doing anybody a favor by opting for peace. Peace is a right for all. All peoples of the region deserve peace, but let's not fool ourselves. In order for peace to be comprehensive, to be lasting, it has to be accepted by the people. In order for the people to accept it, they have to feel that they've gotten a fair deal out of it. And that means, back to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Palestinians have to feel that they've gotten a fair share out of that, that their right to freedom, statehood, end of occupation is exercised. The whole Arab world is there ready to engage with Israel with a view to making sure that the Arab Peace Initiative results in a solution on the basis of the two-state solution. The United States is a key party to that. Nothing can move without the involvement of the United States. But as the US tries to engage, as His Majesty has said, as President Sisi has said, as all of our leaders have said, we are ready to do the heavy lifting. We are ready to do our share in pursuing that peace. But again, we have to address the reasons for the absence of peace, and we have to move forward with them. And the only viable solution that anybody has been able to put on the table thus far is the two-state solution. In the absence of that solution, what is Plan B? And again, I'm quoting His Majesty, if we don't have a Plan B, so we have to focus on Plan A, which is a two-state solution. Thank you.
Well, in fact, the terms of the equation, in fact, that you are rightly pointing out are we have to solve a major thing, a major element that is impacting on the situation on the ground, and it's impacting on wills and souls of the region. That is, we have to solve first the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to create the conditions to prosper, to solve the rest, if I may say so, to get to a scheme of overall stability in the region. And I turn to Chairman Holmes. At a certain point, we had the impression that the American administration, President Trump, wanted to have it the other way around. That is, that no longer, if compared to Obama years, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the top priority, but priorities apparently shifted. Iran and the struggle against Iran would have become the major priority, and in fact, we would have switched in the optics of this was the impression of the United States, from a balanced approach, Saudi versus Iran, Iran versus Saudi, to an approach that is closer to the Saudis and against Iran. And the Israeli and Palestinian crisis apparently went from front to back burner. Are we right to think so? And what kind of conditions you can draw, what kind of conclusions you can draw, if it's true what we see and what we think we appreciate?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this conference for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be up here on the stage with such distinguished gentlemen. I also would like to remind everybody that today in the United States is Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving is the day, of course, that we reserve to spend with our families to give thanks for many blessings that we have in this world, but it looks like this afternoon that all of you are going to be my family. So welcome to the Holmes family. I think that the first point I want to make, I will eventually get around to answering directly the point that you asked about the Trump administration. But before I get there, I wanted to make a couple of other key points about this question of hegemony. It's my view is that the balance of forces in the Middle East right now are pretty much in a rough state of equilibrium. There's no one power, there's no outside power either capable of establishing hegemony. And for many of the countries in the regions that are playing with the outside powers, Russia, the United States, and even now China is starting to get into the mix, even though these countries have their sort of favorite allies, none of them, and I think this even includes Iran, wants to be seen as a client state of an outside power. And so there is a huge effort for many of the nations in the region, even though they have their relationships with an outside power, to maintain as much flexibility as they can to keep the situation fluid. In other words, to keep the situation in a rough equilibrium that it currently we now find ourselves. To this extent, if you want to use the analogy of the Great Game, using the competition between Russia and Great Britain in Afghanistan in the 19th century, if there is a great game in the Middle East today, it's really a game to nowhere, in the sense that any effort to try to establish hegemony is bound to fail. There is no outside power that has either the capacity or the will to really establish this hegemony, and frankly, even their allies and friends inside the Middle East don't want them to do that either. Which leads me to my second point about the United States. I mean, and this sort of goes to your question about the Trump administration. I just came from Germany and Europe, and there's a huge debate on whether President Trump is withdrawing support for the NATO alliance. There's many questions about the U.S.'s commitment to its leadership role. And so this also is a question that pertains to U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I would argue that notwithstanding the fact that the Trump administration has pulled out of the JCPOA, that does not represent a withdrawal from the region at all. As a matter of fact, it represents a greater engagement in the region. And also, even in the question of following up on the Obama administration's policy in Iraq, there were escalated airstrikes. There was more engagement there as well. So I do not see the Trump administration at all pulling back from the Middle East. If anything, I see them actually engaging more in many areas, but obviously in a different way. I think the only reason why many of the things that the president is doing, apart from the rhetoric and the language that he uses and the personal relationships he develops, for example, with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, which are obviously qualitatively different than what's existed in the past, nonetheless, if you discount the fact that what the Obama administration was doing with Iran was actually a transformation of U.S. policy, with the hopes of transforming Iran to become a more stable power in the Middle East. So what the President Trump is doing by reversing that is actually going back to a more traditional U.S. position vis-a-vis Iran. It's in a different environment. Obviously now we have new situations with Syria. Turkey's in a different place, obviously. And then, of course, we've now had many years of fighting ISIS and terrorists inside Iraq. But the point I'm trying to make is that there is actually the basic structures of U.S. policy in the Middle East, particularly its relationship with traditional allies like Jordan, Egypt, UAE, Bahrain, and of course Israel. This is a basic structure of U.S. foreign policy. It's been there for many decades. The emphasis is different, but the basic structure is similar. I think that as for the question of Russia, Russia is obviously more engaged and more involved than it was a few years back, but I don't think even Russia is really in a position to establish any kind of hegemonic position in the Middle East. It doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't have the military forces, it doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the economic wealth to back it up. There are serious limitations, material limitations in what Russia can do. And also on top of that, Russia's main client, which is Assad in Syria, is not a great model for resolving conflicts in the Middle East. And so this leaves a lot of concern on the part of many players in the Middle East that Russia's role there is not being constructive, and it's raising many questions about its purposes. I think that while it is true that the differences between Europe and the United States over the Iran nuclear deal is debilitating, it does give openings to Russia and Iran to divide us, the United States, from its allies. But I do think that Iran has actually reached the high watermark of its influence in the Middle East. There are hundreds of companies now that are leaving Iran. There are swift sanctions on 30 Iranian banks. There are significant economic difficulties in Iran. And I think that this is partly the result of the change in U.S. policy. So to end on my final point, if there is a great game going on for hegemonic competition in the Middle East, it's a great game to nowhere. We don't have to play it. The United States should not play it. We don't have to play it to maintain influence. It's a balancing role. It's to support our friends. It's to battle terrorism. It is not to play any large game of trying to reach any large solution at a macro level to all the problems that beset the Middle East.
Thank you very much. In fact, it was very nasty from us to invite you on Thanksgiving, so I hope that the quality of the conference could come to help you.
I'm looking for a turkey sandwich tonight at the restaurant.
We will try to cope. Turning back to Secretary General ABOUL GHEIT, actually listening to Mr. Holmes and to his remarks about Iran, what actually appears, at least this is judged from outside, is nevertheless that Iran is always a sort of a game changer in the regional balance of power. And so I would be interested in asking, from the Arab League's perception, to what extent the dynamics of the Israeli presence and of the Iranian presence and the dynamics of how can I say, Iranian, what appears to be a consolidation of the Iranian influence in the region, is meaningful as a game changer? That is, could it play a more positive or a more negative role?
Listen, Iran is part of the Middle East, no doubt about that. And they have their own interests. The question is, are they to step beyond their own interests, threatening other people's interests or not? That is an issue. But the other issue, and I draw your attention to a tiny small mistake when you said Israel instead of Iran. We have a nuclear capable country in the midst of us in the region, Israel. So as much as we reject the drive and the effort aiming at acquiring a nuclear capability, whether it is Iranian or Israeli, and we seek declaring the region a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, whether it is biological, chemical, or nuclear, we need to stress the fact that Israel should also be treated equally when it comes to its nuclear capability. That is a point I have to stress. The second thing is, yes, often we hear certain statements emanating from Tehran or from Iranian officials claiming that they have control of the decision-making in several Arab capitals. That should not be. That should not be. Or that we have our own internal ability to control events in this or that capital. So the Iranians, in order to be accepted as a full partner to bringing in stability and tranquility in the region, is to respect other people's interests, other people's territories, and to stop inciting the Iranians. I think it is important on their part to change their behavior. That is most important. In order to facilitate what I spoke about earlier, bringing peace and security in the region, because we have two issues, Palestine and the Iranian behavior in Gulf, aiming at even reaching the Mediterranean.
Well, of course, a complex equation of, how can I say, opposite points of view and opposite capabilities of influencing. Also with, as a matter of fact, this question of nuclear capability of Israel that has to be part of the equation in a way or in the other. But there is also another element, that is a specular element. When we speak about influence, we are speaking about Iranian influence, but we have to speak also about the other customer, that is the Saudi influence, actually at least seen from a European point of view. The dialectics between those two elements contributes to instability in the region overall. So given the balanced attitude of Oman, how you could sketch for us this kind of balance between these opposed influences and the phase in which we are now, also with regard to what is happening within the Gulf countries?
We can only really lead by example. And I think every one of us should embrace that concept. If we embrace that concept of turning, it is famously said that the best way to defeat an enemy is by turning him into a friend. Until when we're going to repeat ourselves from one rhetoric to another, from one dialogue to another, if we don't really translate the values we all share and the values we all believe in, we have heard so much of them today. All the right things are said. How can we turn that into an agenda of action, a positive agenda of action? And I think, as our friend, the Secretary General of the Arab League has said, vis-a-vis Iran or Saudi Arabia or any of us, we are all part of one region. And we've got to come to terms with that reality, that the only way to really reach a situation of a sustainable degree of stability in the long term is that we've got to reach to one another and talk and translate that talk into real concrete action. That is what we have always fostered in Oman, and we have gone a long way in creating a situation after 40 years of hard work, at least, that we have become friends to all. So I think, as I started saying, we led by example, and I hope that example can be beneficial for others to consider.
Thank you very much. I myself come from a country that treasures dialogue and treasures good relations with everybody. Of course, one has to be very careful because it's okay to have good relations with everybody, but then the risk is to become a bit negligible quantity, if I may say so. There is always a balance to be struck from the point of view of the efficacy of being an active subject in foreign policy. I would never have told words like those while acting in the foreign ministry, but as an analyst, of course, I think that it is good to point out time to time the necessity of being aware that you simply can't just across the table be friends with anybody, with everybody. No, at a certain moment, there are priorities and things to choose, but I'm telling it from the point of view of somebody who belongs to a country that usually treasures and shares exactly this kind of attitudes. You would forgive me to a certain extent. And from the Jordanian point of view, we witnessed quite a surge in activity and ambition as far as the Jordanian attitude in the Syrian crisis is considered. How would you describe this kind of political line, Jordanian political line towards Syria, and what are the motivations?
Well, sir, I think it's one consistent with what Jordan has always been about, which is finding solutions, pushing for peace, and trying to face problems with a view to resolving them on bases that can last. So it is not a question of reacting with a view to sort of avoid the problem. Jordan has always been about making peace. And remember, we're in the country in the middle of it all. Syria, we have 378 kilometers of border of Syria, which means our army has to be on an almost war readiness stage for the last 7 years to mitigate against the threat of Daesh that was coming against the border. And we lost some of our own as a result of terrorist operations that came out from Daesh in Syria. We have 1.3 million Syrians in Jordan, refugees. And we're proud to say, and we'll continue to do everything we can for them to make sure that we provide them with education and with support and give them a decent shot at life. Because if we fail to do that, then we will have abandoned them and rendered them easy prey to every radical and agenda there is that is. And so investing in refugees is investing not only in our security as Jordan, but investing in our collective security. And we all have seen that crisis reverberate way beyond the immediate neighborhood into the broader neighborhood. We are a neighboring country to Iraq, 183 kilometers of border with Iraq. Iraq was our largest trading partner, and we lost that during the years of conflict. So we're in the middle of it all, and as such, we cannot but be realistic, and we cannot but work for practical solutions that will allow us to move forward. And that practicality demands that we're honest and we face issues head on, which means looking back to the West, we have the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We cannot, good words and, how is not going to solve it. What is going to solve it is a solution that will, again, address the legitimate rights of both. Occupation ends, a state emerges, Israel is accepted, is secure, then everybody can look forward towards a better future. Syria, what has 7 years of fighting gotten us thus far? A country is destroyed, over 12 million people displaced, over 500,000 people killed. And it's shocking that in all the conversations that we're having about Syria, nobody's mentioning those numbers again. So what is the crisis about? So again, bring back focus to Syria being about Syria and Syrians. How do we move forward? We move forward by all combining our efforts to find a political solution, because there is no military solution. We find a political solution that is realistic, and we cannot continue to double down again on unrealistic conditions. And with all due respect, countries that are 1,000 miles away or 10,000 miles away can live with a prolonged conflict in Syria. We cannot. We cannot but be honest, we cannot but be realistic, and we cannot but do everything we can in cooperation with our partners to try and solve that conflict. And the same for the war on terror. We've suffered the impact of terrorist attacks, and we're facing terrorism on all fronts. And these are fronts that we all need to agree that are essential in order for us to move forward. Daesh, the territorial control is over. Daesh, the security threat remains, and that means we have to work together, closer intelligence and closer defense cooperation. Daesh, the ideological threat, is also something, a struggle, and we are at the forefront of that struggle. And we need to move forward with that, and we all need to face, and if I may quote His Majesty again, these do not represent Islam. These are people who have nothing to do with Islam, and in order to defeat them, we have to unify our narrative and deny them the opportunity of splitting us along, Muslim and non-Muslim lines. The fault line is not between Islam and the rest. The fault line is between few thugs who are outside our humanity, and between the rest of us who share in our common humanity. And that means that we also solve conflicts. So that said, again, with all due respect to all of us wanting to do the right thing, but we have to do the right thing. And if I may go back to the regional hegemony issue, and I totally agree with my dear friend here, the Middle East is no longer a battlefield for hegemony between two main superpowers, as used to be the case during the Cold War. A lot of outside powers are trying to vie for hegemony, and I agree with you, no one country can have that hegemony because the place is just, there are too many crises for anybody to be able to control. And with all due respect, when it comes to Iran or other regional powers, we all want good relations with Iran. The Arab League has adopted over and over again resolutions that urge good relations with Iran. Iran is part of the region, and that's something we respect, and we all would like to have good neighborly relations with Iran on the basis of non-intervention in the internal affairs of the other. But Saudi Arabia is not interfering in the affairs of others. Arabs are not interfering in the internal affairs of Iran. We have issues with certain policies that are interventionist, that are contributing to prolonging crises and deepening crises that we say we have to solve. So we've always urged dialogue with Iran on the basis of trying to establish relations on pillars that can last of respect and non-intervention in the affairs of the other, and respect, the sovereignty of all of us. So ultimately, it's our world. We live in it. The consequences of every crisis has impacted us beyond our ability to tolerate. We're the largest per capita host of refugees anywhere in the world, and yet, we continue to take pride in being a country of moderation, a country of peace, a country that shares its meager resources with the hundreds of thousands that are among us. And we do that out of conviction. We do that because that is who we are. And also, I think what we believe in is that we have to be honest with our friends. And the US is an ally of Jordan, but we have open and honest conversation, and we agree and we disagree. And that's what makes the relationship strong. So I think among all of us, we need to be realistic about the facts. People can live on slogans when they're not affected. The cost of war in Syria has been too high for Syrians, most importantly, and for the neighbors, for Jordan, for Lebanon, for Turkey, for us in the region. So we cannot continue to live with that high war, and we have to end the tragedy, end the killing, end the destruction, so Syria is back a functioning state that is again key to peace and stability. And one last sentence, if I may, again to Iraq, we have a success story there. Let's make sure we do whatever that is right to support Iraq in reconstruction and rebuilding, so that we have at least beginning of a step towards restabilization again.
Very clear. And I think that we can ask Mr. Holmes to react to this. And also, if I may, another question on another aspect of the Syrian situation, that is in Syria, US and Russia are militarily dangerously close. What would be your comment about this?
Well, if I could just respond to the point that you just made. The general consensus here is obviously no outside power or set of outside powers or set of internal powers to the region are going to establish peace from top down. That's not going to happen. If you ever are to have peace in the Middle East, you have to have the building blocks that under any circumstance, in any society, at any time in history, allows the foundations for peace. And you start, of course, with the question of the topic here is the balance of power in the Middle East. If you have a country, in this case Iran, that is interfering in the internal affairs of others, that obviously has to be dealt with before you can ever have any progress. So it's not a matter of just dialogue, it's actually changing the behavior of the regime in order to raise the cost on this activity in such a way that they have decided for their own reasons that it's not something they should be doing. And that, of course, pertains to anyone in Syria or anywhere else where there is someone, a bad actor, if you will, that's destabilizing the region. And so it's first a balance of power. It's second of all establishing the diplomatic and military conditions for a balance of power. So then you can move to the next level and deal with the other questions which are actually more basic. There's the ideological question that you mentioned over the political position of Islam that you and other countries are struggling with. This is something that we in the United States really cannot help you solve, but it's absolutely key to having peace in the Middle East. There's the economic development issue. Until you get the economies in the region on some kind of a firm, stable economic basis, where you have a market economy that's producing enough wealth to eliminate the disparities in wealth in society, you're never going to have peace in the region. And then finally, there is ultimately the question of human rights, which frankly cuts across all of the conflicts in the Middle East. There's a lot of attention right now, rightly so, on the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia and the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. But the Iranians have been involved in equally odious human rights abuses over the years. So this is a general problem that has to be faced and dealt with in the context of security. All of these aspects have to be looked at in the context of security. If they're looked at just as sort of independent issues of what you do with just economics or with human rights, and you have the dialogue there without the larger context of security, in my opinion, you're not going to get anywhere. You asked the question about Israel, the United States, and Syria. There were, of course, just recently sanctions imposed on a Syrian national that was accused of using a Russian-based company to import oil. There is that, and there is, of course, the ongoing attempt to have consultations with the Russians to make sure that we are deconflicted in any kind of military operations we undertake. But I think that the larger question is really diplomatic. And I don't really think that we see eye to eye in any way at this point on what needs to be done with Syria. And so I think we have to wait until there's more of a development, in my personal opinion, in Russia policy.
Yes, I tend to agree. You were brave enough and you were fair enough to be very quick in your answers. So I maybe turn for a third round with a very precise question to each of you, starting from Secretary General ABOUL GHEIT. I can't do otherwise, being in Italy and being only a few weeks after Palermo conference. Libya, what is your perspective? How do you feel about Libya? Is this conflict solvable, or have we to get accustomed just to a management, a long-term management of the Libyan conflict?
Very short answer. As long as you have the militias being financed by the budget of the state through the earnings of oil exports, you will not have peace or government, period.
Very clear. Secretary General. Very clear.
I think there is a solution for every problem. We created these problems. Who created those problems? I am the optimist because I have lived it in Oman. And if we can do it, I don't see why not any one of us can do it. You showed us earlier an interesting clip on the screen where you showed the ugly and the good, in our world. And a thought was running through my head that really there's more good in our world that should unite us than there is bad that should divide us. And we should work more and more on the positive aspects of our world and our values. And I think, again, by elevating ourselves to that noble vision and work and act upon it, we should get there. We should refrain, I really believe, at the end, from this constant tradition of the blame game. We keep blaming everyone else except ourselves. And I think, we should come to terms with the realities. Yes, there have been some bad things, we've created, and accept that and move beyond it, move on with it. And it's time, I think, we owe a lot to our generations and the future generations. History will judge us by what we do now. And so I think I really need to end on a positive note by still, again and again, call for credible dialogue that is frank, that is transparent, between opposite sides in order to find a common ground which will enable us all to work for finding solutions for our region and for our generations.
Thank you very much. A glimpse of hope. Mr. Minister, management or solution?
Libya?
Libya.
Well, I think thus far we've been managing, and I think as we try to look for a solution, we need to probably step back a little bit and ask what got us where we got. There's a great deal of adventurism, a great deal of uninformed decisions that have gone into the making of the crisis that Libya has become, as is the case with many of the crises that we're grappling with. I think what Mr. Abul Ghait referred to in terms of this is a civil war that is self-financing, makes it much more difficult to address. But ultimately, there are too many players, there are too many processes. In order to get forward, we need to, again, have an end game that we all agree on. And unfortunately, whether it's from Libya to Syria to other crises, we do not have an end game. We're engaging from day to day. We're looking at the processes rather than the outcome. And that is a problem that we've seen with many of the crises that we're having to deal with. So let's go back to the drawing board. Have a proper baseline of what is it that caused the problem, who are the players, and how do we move forward. It's going to be a long process. And back to what our friend said here, just Libya is part of a bigger problem. We have to have a holistic approach to the issues, a holistic in terms of geography, but also a holistic in terms of all other components of it. Because Daesh terrorism is part of the problem. If you solve Daesh in Syria, and you solve it in Iraq, and you don't solve it in Libya, they're going to come back, regroup, and re-emerge, and come back at us. If you solve it in Libya, don't solve it in Somalia, they're going to do the same. And that's why in Jordan, His Majesty has initiated the Aqaba process, which is basically, again, a place for all of us, concerned to sit together and think in practical terms of how do we unite our efforts and how do we employ that holistic approach with a view to making sure that we are effective in our efforts to solve crisis. Otherwise, we're going to continue to manage and, without having solutions that are permanent and that are lasting, then the threat of them re-emerging would always be there.
Thank you very much. And where is the administration on that?
Well, the short answer to your question, this is my opinion, I won't speak on behalf of the administration, is the only answer is management. From the U.S. point of view, we've learned some hard lessons over the last decade over the limitations of the use of military force in the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. It doesn't mean that the United States is completely averse to it. We're obviously still involved in limited military operations in Syria. But this has politically reduced the appetite in this administration and in Washington and from the American people to take any kind of hard lead in these very difficult conflicts, of which Libya is a perfect example. For the United States, the idea of the United States intervening in a civil war in the Middle East is something that is not very popular right now.
Well, I think that we are approaching, even if we still have some time, but I think that we dwelt more or less about all the components that this panel was meant to dwell on. Maybe it is difficult to make a synthesis of what emerged, but I would say that maybe management prevails in the opinion here of the panel about concrete possibilities of having short-term solutions. Of course, this does not mean that we don't have to employ all the possible means, diplomatic, intelligence, I mean, using all the leverages that we dispose of, and the also employing companies, employing civil societies, etc. But certainly solutions, at least in the big crises that confront us, are not at hand. And you have to prepare for a difficult and harsh process of not only dialogue, but maybe sometimes also increased confrontation and choices. I'm afraid that I can't end on a more optimistic note, but since we are in Med dialogues, and so the optimism of will, as our Omani minister was just saying, has to prevail. So I think that we can't spare efforts in order to have solutions to concrete problems. This is with a note of hope that I wanted to end this panel and thank all our excellent panelists for having contributed to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I agree with you.